Case number 1. Vladimir Nikolayev, the Kaboxery cannibal.
I cut off his head, arms, legs. All of a sudden, something kind of struck me, and I thought I would try it. I gave some meat to one of my friends. She made dumplings with it. She had some herself and fed it to her children.
Kaboxery sits on the Volga River, a mid-sized industrial city that, in the mid-1990s, had bigger problems than crime statistics. The whole country was in economic freefall, and this corner of it was no exception. It's against that backdrop, in 1996, that one of the more disturbing cases in post-Soviet criminal history quietly began, not with a plan, but with a drunken argument that spiraled out of control inside a cramped apartment. Vladimir Nikolayev was unemployed, a heavy drinker, and already known to local police, theft, assault, the kind of record that gets a man written off as a lost cause rather than watched as a danger. He was born in 1959 in the Chuvash Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, and by most accounts, his path had been set early, a working-class upbringing, a drift into petty crime through his teens and 20s, short stays in local detention that never seemed to change anything. None of it, on paper, suggested what came next. One night in 1996, drinking with an acquaintance, Nikolayev got into a fight. He knocked the man out cold, and then, instead of the fight simply ending there, something in him decided it wasn't over. He killed him. What Nikolayev did afterward is what separates this case from an ordinary drunken homicide. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He dragged the body to his bathroom, laid it in the tub, and methodically dismembered it with an axe and a kitchen knife, working with the kind of clinical detachment investigators would later say was almost unnervingly calm. And then he did something almost impossible to process. He cooked part of the body in his own kitchen and ate it. What happened with the rest of the remains is the detail that would eventually blow the case open. Nikolayev packaged the leftover meat and carried it to a neighbor's apartment as a gift, telling her it was fresh kangaroo, supposedly picked up from a market that occasionally sold exotic cuts. She had no reason to doubt him. She cooked it for her family. It was her daughter who first said something felt wrong, the taste, the texture, something that didn't sit right, and pushed her mother to take a sample to a doctor rather than shrug it off. That single decision, a teenager trusting her own instinct over a stranger's word, is the reason this case ever reached a courtroom at all. By the time investigators pieced together where that kangaroo meat had actually come from and arrived at Nikolayev's door, they discovered he hadn't stopped at one victim. A second body, killed under similar circumstances, was already being stored in pieces in his balcony freezer, left out in the Volga winter like any other food. When detectives sat him down for questioning, they braced for denial, for excuses, for some kind of psychological collapse. They got none of it. Nikolayev answered every question in a flat, almost bored tone, walking them through the butchering process step by step as if describing a recipe. When asked why, his answer wasn't rage or hatred or trauma. It was curiosity. He said he simply wanted to know what it was like. In 1997, a Russian court convicted him on 2 counts of murder and handed down a death sentence, the outcome that, at the time, felt like the only proportionate response to a crime this far outside ordinary human behavior. But the timing worked against the sentence ever being carried out. Russia was in the process of joining the Council of Europe, and one of the conditions of membership was a moratorium on capital punishment. Nikolayev's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment almost as a formality of international diplomacy, a bureaucratic footnote that let a man who had eaten another human being keep breathing. He was transferred to Black Dolphin shortly after it opened its doors to Russia's most extreme offenders, and there he has remained ever since. What makes Nikolayev's case unusual, even among the 5 men in this file, is what happened years later, when a National Geographic crew was granted the rare privilege of filming inside Black Dolphin. It was Nikolayev who ended up as the face of the documentary, the inmate who agreed to sit in front of the camera, behind double rows of steel bars, and describe what he'd done. Viewers who watched it noted the same thing detectives had noted decades earlier: no visible remorse, no hesitation, the same even, matter-of-fact delivery he'd used in his very first interrogation. It was as if the years inside hadn't changed him at all, only given him a wider audience. Today, Nikolayev is somewhere in his mid-60s, still inside Federal Penitentiary Colony No. 6, still under 24-hour surveillance, still bent double, and blindfolded on the rare occasions he leaves his cell. Shiboksary has moved on. The apartment where it happened is, by most accounts, unremarkable now, indistinguishable from any other on the block. But the case remains one of the touchstones of Russian true crime, not because of the body count, which was comparatively small, but because of exactly how far one man was willing to go and how ordinary he seemed the whole time he was doing it. Case number 2, Derrick Todd Lee. Between 1998 and 2003, the women of southern Louisiana lived under a shadow of quiet panic. A predator was operating in the college towns and quiet neighborhoods of Baton Rouge and Lafayette, breaking into homes, bypassing security systems, and assaulting and murdering his victims before vanishing without a trace. The killings began on September 24, 2001, with the strangulation of 41-year-old Gina Wilson Green inside her Baton Rouge home, and continued over the following 2 years as more women were found dead in the same quiet, unremarkable neighborhoods. Investigators eventually confirmed at least 7 victims, among them college students, nurses, and young mothers, including Charlotte Murray Pace and Geraldine DeSoto. And DNA evidence tied the same man to nearly every scene. The investigation nearly collapsed under a false assumption. Acting on an early FBI behavioral profile, a multi-agency task force spent the better part of a year hunting for a white man in his mid-20s to mid-30s, reportedly driving a white pickup truck near one of the crime scenes. Police collected DNA samples from more than 1,000 men who matched that profile, and every single one came back negative. It was only after the murder of Louisiana State University graduate student Carrie Yoder in March 2003 that investigators began broadening the search beyond the original profile, and the case turned almost immediately once they did. On May 5, 2003, a DNA swab was taken from a black man already known to police for a history of stalking and burglary complaints. A man the profile had caused investigators to overlook for months, even though his name had crossed their desks before. His name was Derrick Todd Lee, and the results matched him to the murders of Green, Pace, Pam Kinamore, Trinisha Kalam, and Yoder. He was arrested on May 27, 2003, at a motel in Atlanta, Georgia, after a joint FBI and local task force tracked him down. Lee was born on November 5, 1968, in St. Francisville, Louisiana, just minutes from Angola's front gate. His father struggled with mental illness and left the family early, and Lee was raised primarily by his mother, later placed in special education classes due to a low IQ. He accumulated a long juvenile and adult record of peeping Tom incidents, home break-ins, and stalking complaints, all of which had brought him to the attention of local police long before the murders began, without ever being connected to them. To neighbors, co-workers, and the women he charmed in bars and motels, he presented as an outgoing, likable construction worker. Diane Alexander, one of his few known survivors, would later testify against him after surviving a brutal assault in 2002 that closely matched the pattern of his confirmed killings. Lee stood trial first for the May 2002 murder of Charlotte Murray Pace, who had been stabbed more than 80 times and beaten with a household iron in her own home. DNA and physical evidence tied him directly to the scene, and in August 2004, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder and recommended death. He was tried separately for the killing of Geraldine DeSoto, and because that jury's vote fell one short of unanimous on the top charge, he was convicted there of second-degree murder and received an automatic life sentence that runs alongside, rather than in place of, his death sentence. Na linked him to the remaining killings, without separate trials ever being pursued. Forensic analysts would later estimate, based on DNA markers, that Lee's ancestry was roughly 85% African, a finding that stood in direct contradiction to the profile that had shaped the task force's search for the better part of a year. Investigators and prosecutors who worked the case have since pointed to those wasted months as one of the clearest cautionary examples in modern American law enforcement of how a single flawed behavioral assumption can extend a killer's freedom, even while the underlying physical evidence sat untouched in evidence storage the entire time. Compounding the case's difficulty, another Baton Rouge area serial killer, Sean Vincent Gillis, was later found to have been operating in the same region during roughly the same years, a coincidence that for a time complicated efforts to attribute individual killings to the correct offender. At his sentencing hearing for the Pace murder, Lee raised his hand in a V for victory gesture as he was led from the courtroom and shouted toward his family that the jury had ignored evidence he believed was planted, a claim he continued to repeat throughout his appeals despite the DINA record against him. Upon arrival on Angola's death row, a high-security block isolated within the prison's vast perimeter, Lee was placed under strict cell confinement. He spent more than a decade filing appeals that challenged the state's DINA collection procedures and argued, without success, that his troubled upbringing and low IQ should have spared him execution. He kept a low profile among the condemned population, an unremarkable presence for a man once considered the most dangerous predator Louisiana had seen in a generation. The state never carried out his execution. On January 21st, 2016, Lee was transported from Angola to a hospital in Baton Rouge after suffering severe cardiac complications. He died there at age 47, ending a death sentence not by lethal injection, but by heart disease, the same ordinary failure that kills thousands of men his age every year, condemned or free. Case number 3. Vladimir Mukhankin, Chikatilo's self-appointed heir.
Mukhankin committed his last 2 murders on the same day.
First, he attacked a mother and daughter. An hour later, he took the life of another woman, a guard at a railway depot.
To understand Vladimir Mukhankin, you have to understand the shadow he was standing in. In the same Rostov region where Mukhankin would later kill, Andrei Chikatilo, the so-called Rostov Ripper, one of the most prolific serial killers of the 20th century, had spent over a decade murdering more than 50 people before he was finally caught, and in 1994 executed. Chikatilo's trial had been a national sensation, covered in exhaustive, gruesome detail by a Russian press, finally free to report on organized crime and violence the Soviet system used to suppress entirely. For most people who followed that coverage, it was a story of horror finally ending. For Vladimir Mukhankin, watching from inside the prison system where he was already serving time for robbery and assault, it seems to have read as something else entirely, a challenge. Mukhankin was born in 1960, also in the Rostov region, into a childhood that gave him little reason to expect anything good from the world. Severe physical abuse, neglect, early institutionalization in juvenile reformatories. The kind of biography that shows up again and again in the files of men who go on to commit extreme violence, though of course it explains nothing on its own about why some people who endure it don't. By his early 30s, he'd already cycled through Soviet-era labor camps more than once. It was during one of those stretches behind bars that he followed Chikatilo's case obsessively, and by his own later account, became convinced he could not only match that body count, but exceed it, that he could carve out his own legacy in the same stretch of countryside. He began in February 1995. Whatever restraint had kept him in check before was gone. Armed with knives and blunt weapons, Mukhankin targeted vulnerable people in the same kind of desolate, unwatched terrain Chikatilo had once used. Railroad embankments, deserted fields on the edge of towns, and over roughly 2 months, 8 victims, mostly women and young girls, were found murdered and mutilated. The speed of it is what alarmed investigators most. This wasn't a killer working carefully, spacing out his crimes to avoid detection. This was someone in a hurry, someone who seemed to want the number to climb as fast as possible, almost daring police to catch him before he reached whatever target he'd set for himself. That urgency worked against him. A killer moving that fast, taking that many risks in such a short window, leaves more chances for something to go wrong, and in May 1995, one did. A victim survived his attack and was able to give investigators a description specific enough to identify him. When they arrested Mukhankin, he didn't deny anything. If anything, he seemed to want credit. He told investigators, without prompting, that he considered himself an apprentice of Chikatilo, the word he actually used, and detectives searching his belongings found notebooks filled with violent poetry and writing, a kind of private mythology he'd been building around his own crimes. In 1996, the Rostov Regional Court convicted him on 8 counts of murder and 3 of attempted murder, and sentenced him to death. Like the others in this file, that sentence never carried out. The national moratorium intervened, commuting it to life, and Mukhankin was transferred to Black Dolphin to serve it out. There's a bitter irony in what happened next, one worth sitting with. Mukhankin had wanted infamy. He'd wanted a body count and a name people would say, the way they said Chikatilo's. What he got instead, inside Black Dolphin's walls, was total erasure. No interviews, no notoriety, no audience of any kind, just a strict regime designed specifically to deny men like him the recognition that seemed to have partly motivated them in the first place. He spends his days in near total isolation, decades removed from anyone who might have once feared his name, serving a sentence with no release date and, as far as anyone outside the colony knows, no voice left to tell his story with. Case number 4, the Angola 3. On April 17, 1972, 23-year-old corrections officer Brent Miller was found stabbed to death inside a dormitory at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, the victim of what investigators called a chaotic uprising tied to overcrowding and abuse inside the prison's segregated housing. Prison guard Brent Miller was violently attacked in an Angola dorm during the unrest, and in the frantic search for suspects that followed, attention turned quickly to 2 inmates already known to prison administrators as organizers, Herman Wallace and Albert Woodfox. Both men were serving time for armed robbery, and both had helped found the first prison chapter of the Black Panther Party at Angola, running literacy classes, self-defense instruction, and an anti-rape initiative among the general population, work that made them deeply unpopular with the guards who ran the tiers. Within hours of Miller's death, Wallace and Woodfox were pulled from population and placed into what would become more than 4 decades of near-total isolation, held in cells roughly 6 feet by 9 for 23 hours a day. A third man, Robert King, was transferred into Angola weeks after the killing and had no plausible connection to it, yet he was swept into the same investigation and placed in the same isolation unit, where he would remain for 29 years, despite no formal explanation ever being given for the case against him. Wallace and Woodfox were convicted of Miller's murder in 1974, largely on the strength of a single inmate eyewitness who was later revealed to have been coached and rewarded by prison officials, along with a bloody fingerprint at the scene that did not match either man. Both convictions were overturned and reinstated repeatedly over the following decades, undone at various points by findings of racial bias in grand jury selection, prosecutorial misconduct, and juror irregularities, only for the state to retry and reconvict. King's case moved on a separate track entirely. He was convicted in 1973 of killing a fellow inmate inside the same isolation unit, a conviction that collapsed on appeal, and he walked out of Angola in 2001, the first of the 3 to go free. Wallace's release came 12 years later under far darker circumstances, dying of liver cancer. He was freed in October 2013 after a judge threw out his conviction, and he died just 3 days later, having spent effectively his entire adult life inside a solitary cell for a crime supporters insist he did not commit. Woodfox, the last of the 3 still held, saw his conviction vacated a 3rd time by a federal appeals court in 2014, and after the state finally abandoned efforts to try him again, he walked free in February 2016, at 69 years old, closing out what human rights groups have called the longest stretch of solitary confinement in American prison history. The state has never conceded the men's innocence, and Miller's family has maintained publicly that the right men were convicted, leaving the Angola 3, even now, a case where the physical prison term is over, but the argument over what actually happened in that dormitory in 1972 is not. Case number 5, Sergey Shipilov, the prisoner who kept killing.
The killer never expressed any remorse or regret. On the contrary, at his trial, he accused the victims' relatives of greed for demanding compensation for moral damages. On October 25, 2000, Shipilov was found guilty of 12 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment.
Of the 5 men held inside Black Dolphin's walls in this file, Sergey Shipilov's case is the one that embarrassed the Russian penal system the most, because for nearly 2 years, the system itself was the reason he got away with it. The story starts in the Vologda Oblast, a rural region north of Moscow, where in the mid-1990s, young women began vanishing along country roads and transit routes. At first, these read as the kind of isolated missing persons, cases that rural regions see periodically. A woman who didn't come home, assumed to have simply left, or gotten into trouble that had nothing to do with foul play. It took investigators time to notice the pattern, and even longer to trace it back to its source, because the answer, when they finally found it, wasn't the kind of thing anyone was looking for. Sergey Shipilov, born in 1959, was already a convicted criminal, serving a sentence for rape at an open regime penal colony in the Vologda region as of 1995. Open regime colonies operate on a philosophy of graduated trust. Inmates who behave well follow the rules, and show signs of rehabilitation are given increasing freedoms. The idea being that a controlled taste of responsibility helps prepare them to eventually re-enter society. Shipilov, by all appearances, was a model case for that philosophy. He was cooperative, he caused no trouble, and on the strength of that record, prison administrators granted him trusted status as a driver, putting him behind the wheel of trucks, moving goods in and out of the facility's perimeter, largely unsupervised. It's almost impossible to overstate how much freedom that single administrative decision handed him. A man serving a sentence for a violent sexual offense was given a vehicle, a route, and hours at a time, with no direct guard watching what he did with them. Shipilov used that freedom exactly the way you'd fear a man with his history might. Along his delivery routes through rural Vologda, he began picking up hitchhikers and vulnerable women traveling alone. People who had no reason to be wary of a truck that, as far as they knew, belonged to a legitimate delivery job. He drove them to secluded, wooded areas away from the road, and then he murdered them, before calmly returning to the penal colony in time to check in for evening roll call, as if nothing at all had happened that day. Between 1995 and 1997, that routine repeated itself again and again. What made it so difficult to catch wasn't cleverness on Shipilov's part so much as a blind spot built into the investigation itself. Detectives working the disappearances were, understandably, looking for a free man, someone who could come and go as he pleased, someone with no fixed schedule tying him down. It never occurred to them, for a long time, that the person they wanted might be clocking in and out of a state institution every single evening. His status as an inmate wasn't a constraint on his crimes. It was his alibi. The case finally broke on forensic evidence rather than a witness or a confession. Tire tracks recovered near a dump site were matched to the specific prison vehicle Shipilov had been assigned to drive. Once investigators had that thread, it unraveled quickly. When he was arrested and confronted with the evidence, Shipilov confessed, and the number he gave them was staggering. 14 women murdered during the period he held trusted status, on top of the earlier violent offense that had put him in the colony in the first place. The fallout went well beyond Shipilov himself. His case forced a nationwide review of Russia's work release and trusted status programs, a reckoning over how a system built to reward good behavior had instead handed a serial killer the exact tools he needed to keep killing, undetected, for 2 years. In 1999, Shipilov was convicted of 14 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment without any possibility of parole. Every privilege he'd once held, the truck, the roots, the trust, was stripped away permanently, and he was sent directly into Black Dolphin's highest level of restriction. His entire existence narrowed down to a single steel cell. There's a particular kind of dread in Shipilov's case that the others in this file don't quite carry, because it isn't really a story about one man's violence. It's a story about how close a functioning bureaucracy can come to enabling exactly the thing it's supposed to prevent. How a policy built on second chances, applied to the wrong person, becomes something closer to a hunting license. Vologda changed its procedures because of what Shipilov did. Whether that's enough of a legacy to weigh against 14 lives is a question that case files can't really answer. Case number 6, Robert Lee Willie. In the early hours of May 28, 1980, 18-year-old Faith Hathaway left a lounge near Mandeville, Louisiana, where she had spent the evening celebrating her upcoming enlistment in the Army. She never made it home. 2 men picked her up that night, drove her to a secluded, wooded gorge in Washington Parish known as Frick's Cave, raped her, and stabbed her to death, one holding her down while the other cut her throat. Her body was not found for a week, discovered only after an investigator located her scattered belongings nearby. The men responsible were career criminal Robert Lee Willie and his accomplice Joseph Vaccaro, and their crimes did not end with Hathaway. 3 days later, the same 2 men abducted a young couple and left one of them for dead in an Alabama forest, launching a manhunt that would end in Arkansas and produce a case that would eventually reshape the national conversation on capital punishment. Willie was born on January 2, 1958, in Mandeville, Louisiana, and by adulthood had accumulated a lengthy record that included burglary, escape, and drug offenses, along with uncorroborated claims, made only by Willie himself and never independently confirmed, that he had killed at least 2 other men in separate incidents before the Hathaway murder. On May 31, 1980, 3 days after killing Hathaway, Willie and Vaccaro abducted 20-year-old Mark Brewster and his 16-year-old girlfriend, Debbie Cuevas, at gunpoint from a riverfront parking spot in Madisonville. They forced the couple to drive across state lines into Alabama, where Cuevas was repeatedly raped over the following hours, and Brewster was shot twice, had his throat slashed, and was tied to a tree and left for dead. Brewster survived, though he was left partially paralyzed for life. Cuevas was eventually released after the 2 men stopped at an acquaintance's trailer, where the acquaintance talked them out of killing her. Because the men had crossed state lines with their captives, the kidnapping became a federal case in addition to the Louisiana murder charge already pending against them. In the days after Cuevas was released, both men continued moving across state lines, and investigators pieced together the connection between the Hathaway killing and the Brewster and Cuevas abduction through overlapping physical evidence and witness accounts gathered in both Louisiana and Alabama. Willie and Vaccaro were arrested on June 3, 1980, in Hope, Arkansas, on unrelated charges that ultimately connected them to both crime scenes. Vaccaro, who cooperated with prosecutors to a greater degree, was convicted of first-degree murder for the Hathaway killing, but received a life sentence after the jury deadlocked on punishment. Willie was convicted of first-degree murder, aggravated rape, and aggravated kidnapping, and in October 1980, a jury sentenced him to death for Hathaway's murder. He was additionally convicted on federal kidnapping charges tied to the Brewster and Cuevas abduction, a conviction he later leaned on strategically, reportedly hoping a federal sentence might delay or complicate his Louisiana execution. It did not. During his years on Angola's death row, Willie became one of the men whose case shaped Sister Helen Prejean's ministry to condemned inmates. Prejean, a New Orleans nun, served as his spiritual advisor through the final years of his appeals, and her experiences with Willie and another Louisiana death row inmate later formed the basis of her 1993 book, Dead Man Walking, adapted 2 years later into the Oscar-winning film of the same name. In the years leading up to his execution, Willie had a tattoo of the Grim Reaper placed on his chest and told reporters he was not afraid to die, describing himself in one interview as a cold person rather than an animal, pushing back on how the press had characterized him. Robert Lee Willie was executed at Angola on December 28, 1984, at the age of 26, strapped into the state's electric chair, nicknamed Gruesome Gertie by the inmates who feared it, and by that point the 6th man electrocuted in Louisiana in just over a year. Witnesses reported that his body jerked upright with the first jolt of electricity, slumped at the second, rose again at the third, and did not move after the fourth. He addressed his final words to Hathaway's mother and stepfather, who witnessed the execution alongside 7 other witnesses, telling them he hoped his death brought them relief and that killing, in any form, whether by citizens, countries, or governments, was wrong. He spent his final day with his mother, 3 brothers, and Prejean, and asked the warden to remove his hood in the chamber so he could look at his spiritual advisor one last time. Vaccaro remained in the federal system on the kidnapping conviction and was never executed. Nearly 45 years later, Willie's case remains one of the most examined death penalty stories in American legal history, not for any doubt about his guilt, but for what his execution and Prejean's account of it revealed about the machinery of capital punishment itself. Case number 7. Ilnaz Galyavyev, the Kazan school shooter.
Shootings are a rare occurrence in Russia, but on Tuesday, tragedy struck in the city of Kazan, where a lone gunman opened fire at school number 175, killing 7 8th-grade students and 1 teacher.
Some cases in this file are disturbing because of what they reveal about a killer's psychology, an obsession, a pattern built up over years. This one is disturbing for the opposite reason. It took less than 10 minutes, and the person responsible had, until that morning, been almost invisible. Kazan is the capital of Tatarstan, a city of just over 1 million people, and on the morning of May 11, 2021, it became the site of the deadliest school attack in Russia's post-Soviet history. The attack targeted Gymnasium No. 175, a school with roughly 714 students and 70 staff present at the time. The attacker was a 19-year-old former student of the school named Ilnaz Galyavyev. Galyavyev had graduated from that same school 6 years earlier and had recently been expelled from a local technical college for poor academic performance. Before the attack, he had visited the school unarmed to find out the class schedule and was chased away by the school psychologist. On the morning of the attack, Galyavyev detonated a pipe bomb at the school's entrance, then opened fire with a shotgun. 9 people were killed, 7 of them students and 2 of them teachers, and another 139 people were injured in the chaos that followed, with investigators later recognizing an extraordinary 667 people as victims in the case. He was arrested the same day. What investigators found in the aftermath was, in some ways, more unsettling than the attack itself. No long criminal history, no manifesto circulated to allies, nothing resembling a plan built with anyone else. Investigators said Galyavyev had sought to imitate the actions of members of a destructive subculture he had encountered online, copying their behavior during the attack. During the investigation, he claimed he was God and said he had a monster inside him. That claim triggered a lengthy psychiatric process. Galyavyev was found to be mentally ill after a psychiatric evaluation, despite having no prior diagnosis, but Russia's investigative committee ultimately found him to be of sound mind and fit to stand trial. He pleaded guilty on all counts, including murder, attempted murder, and illegal production and possession of explosives. The investigative committee said he fully admitted his guilt and repented. On April 13, 2023, the Supreme Court of Tatarstan sentenced him to life imprisonment in a special regime penal colony, and an appeals court in Nizhny Novgorod upheld that sentence in August of the same year. Prosecutors also secured a compensation order of roughly 121 million rubles for the victims' families. Unlike some of the men in this file, Galyavyev didn't spend years perfecting a method or hunting in the same stretch of city night after night. His entire case is compressed into a single morning, which is part of why it shook Russia as hard as it did. It was the deadliest school attack in the country since the 2004 Beslan siege, and it happened with almost no warning at all. He is now held at Ike 6 in Sol-Iletsk, Orenburg Oblast, better known as Black Dolphin, under the same severe isolation regime applied to the colony's highest-risk inmates. His case resurfaced in headlines again recently, when Russian media reported he had married an 18-year-old journalism student inside the prison, a relationship that reportedly began through letters she started sending him as a teenager shortly after the attack. There's no elaborate psychology to draw out here, no fixation on another killer's legacy, just a former student, a school he once walked the halls of, and 9 people who never got the chance to grow older. Case number 8. Ronald Dominique. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, law enforcement agencies across 9 Louisiana parishes began recovering the bodies of young men from sugarcane fields, drainage canals, and remote bayous. Most of the victims were homeless, struggling with addiction, or working as male sex workers, and for years investigators treated the deaths as isolated overdoses or unconnected disputes rather than the work of one man. It was not until 2005, when a task force re-examined the cold cases side by side, that the pattern became impossible to ignore. A single man had been quietly hunting the margins of Louisiana society for nearly a decade, and his body count would eventually rival that of the most prolific killers in American history. On December 1st, 2006, police arrested a soft-spoken, overweight 42-year-old handyman living in a homeless shelter in Houma, Louisiana. His name was Ronald Dominique. Dominique was born on January 9th, 1964, in Thibodaux, Louisiana, the youngest of 6 children in a poor family living in a trailer park outside town. He struggled with his weight and low self-esteem as a child, was frequently bullied by classmates, and came to understand he was gay shortly before graduating high school in 1983, at a time and in a place where that realization brought further isolation rather than relief. As an adult, he drifted between odd jobs and small towns in the Bayou country, spending his evenings at local gay bars where some of the same classmates who had bullied him recognized and further targeted him. Lacking the physical intimidation of a typical violent offender, Dominique relied entirely on deception. He targeted vulnerable young men with offers of money, shelter, or alcohol, then convinced them to let him bind their hands under the pretense of a game or a wrestling contest. Once his victims were restrained, he raped and then strangled or suffocated them, dumping their bodies in remote locations where heat and rainfall destroyed trace evidence quickly. Because so many of his targets moved frequently between shelters, work camps, and temporary housing, their disappearances often went unreported for weeks, and when remains were eventually found, decomposition in the Louisiana heat made positive identification difficult. A combination of factors that let Dominique continue operating in the same handful of parishes for years without drawing sustained investigative attention. As a teenager, Dominique had been a regular vocalist in his high school's choir and glee club performances, a detail that acquaintances later described as strikingly at odds with the man investigators eventually charged. Investigators finally closed in after Dina linked Dominique to victims Manuel Reed and Oliver LeBancs, and he was arrested at the homeless shelter where he had been living. Following his arrest, Dominique gave a full, videotaped confession describing in flat, methodical detail how he had killed at least 23 men between 1997 and 2006. He told investigators he killed his victims to eliminate them as witnesses, explaining that a prior 1996 rape arrest and the prospect of returning to prison had left him unwilling to risk exposure again. To avoid the death penalty, Dominique pleaded guilty in a Terrebonne Parish courtroom on September 23, 2008, to 8 counts of first-degree murder in exchange for 8 consecutive life sentences without parole. A 9th life sentence followed months later after a separate guilty plea in neighboring Lafourche Parish. The remaining killings he confessed to were never separately prosecuted, and by design of the plea agreement, the true final total remains unresolved. At his September 2008 sentencing, an assistant district attorney told the courtroom that Dominique had known nothing about his victims or their families before he killed them, and that he had left behind a lifetime of pain as the only legacy of those crimes. Dominique bowed his head as the names of the 8 men covered by his plea were read aloud, and offered no statement of his own. Dominique was processed into Angola to begin serving his sentences in 2008. Given the nature of his crimes and his vulnerability to retaliation from the general population, prison officials placed him in protective custody within the facility's maximum security housing. Despite the scale of what he had done, his case drew comparatively little national media attention, a disparity widely attributed by journalists and advocates to the marginalized status of his victims, many of whom had no family actively searching for them when they disappeared. Today, Dominique remains inside Angola's perimeter, one of the most prolific confirmed serial killers in American history, serving out 9 life sentences in a level of obscurity that stands in sharp contrast to the number of families his crimes left behind. Case number 9. Oleg Rylkov, the Tolyatti Ripper.
I lured the girl into the forest on the outskirts of the city, and there I killed her.
But you knew that she knew?
Yes,
And you still went through with it?
yes,
So you knew in advance that you would kill her?
yes, exactly.
Tolyatti doesn't get much attention outside Russia, but inside the country it's known as the engine of Soviet, and later Russian, car manufacturing, home to the massive Avtovaz plant that built the Lada. It's a planned industrial city, all wide boulevards and identical apartment blocks, the kind of place built for efficiency rather than character, which made it, for a few terrible years in the 1990s, an unusually easy place for a predator to disappear into. Between 1993 and 1997, women and girls in Tolyatti were being attacked in stairwells, in isolated fields on the edge of the city, in the gaps between one streetlight and the next. There was no obvious pattern connecting the crimes at first. Different neighborhoods, different times of day, different types of victims. That absence of an obvious signature was, in itself, the signature. The man responsible left almost nothing behind. No forensic trail worth speaking of. No consistent method that jumped out at investigators combing through separate case files. The press, once they realized the scale of it, gave him a name that stuck. The Tolyatti Ripper. His actual name was Oleg Rylkov, born in 1966 in the Samara Oblast. If you'd worked alongside him, you likely wouldn't have looked at him twice. Co-workers and neighbors describe someone thoroughly unremarkable, quiet, forgettable. Nothing in his manner that hinted at what he was doing after hours. That ordinariness wasn't an accident. Rylkov operated with a level of method that separates an opportunistic attacker from something more calculated. He targeted a wide range of victims, children as young as 6 alongside grown women, which on its own tells investigators something about the nature of the compulsion driving him. And as his attacks continued, the violence escalated. What began as sexual assault increasingly ended in murder, because a surviving victim was a witness, and a witness was a liability he wasn't willing to leave behind. The spree ran for roughly 4 years before it ended, and it ended almost the way these cases always seem to, because one victim survived and remembered enough. A surviving woman gave detectives details specific enough to finally put a name to the pattern, and in 1997, Rylkov was arrested. When investigators went back through years of unsolved cases with his name in hand, the numbers were staggering. At least 12 murders confirmed, more than 30 separate sexual assaults, and a strong suspicion among the detectives who worked the case that the real total was higher than anything they could prove in court. In 1998, he was convicted and sentenced to death. Like so many others swept up in Russia's moratorium on executions, that sentence became life imprisonment instead, and Rylkov was sent to Black Dolphin not long after. This is where Rylkov's file takes a strange turn, one that says as much about the Russian justice system as it does about the man himself. Life inside a Supermax, built to be as close to solitary confinement as a group facility can manage, is, by design, monotonous to the point of psychological erosion. Rylkov found a loophole. Over the following 2 decades, he periodically reached out to prosecutors claiming new memories had surfaced, details about unsolved killings from his old hunting grounds back in the Samara region. Under Russian procedure, a confession like that isn't something investigators can simply take at his word from inside a cell. It requires a formal walkthrough, an on-site reconstruction, which meant transporting Rylkov out of Black Dolphin and back to the towns where he'd once hunted. Whether every one of those recovered memories was genuine is something investigators have quietly debated for years. What's not in dispute is the effect it had on Rylkov's day-to-day existence. Each confession bought him a temporary escape from the 4 walls of his cell, a supervised trip under heavy guard, but a trip nonetheless, a break in a routine that otherwise never varied. For a man serving life without any real hope of release, manipulating cold cases became less about confession and more about currency, a way to purchase brief glimpses of a world he'd otherwise never see again. Rylkov remains in Black Dolphin today, one of the facility's longest-serving inmates. Whether prosecutors in Samara Oblast will ever hear from him again, whether there are more names still locked away, real or invented, waiting to buy him one more trip outside, is something only he knows for certain. Case number 10. Sea Murder, Corey Miller. Corey Miller was born on March 9, 1971, in New Orleans, and grew up largely in the city's Calliope projects. He briefly enlisted in the Army as a young man before going absent without leave in 1990 to return home after his brother Kevin was murdered. A loss that pulled him back toward New Orleans and, eventually, toward the music career his family was beginning to build around his brother Percy, known professionally as Master P. As No Limit Records grew into one of the most commercially successful independent labels of the late 1990s, Miller became one of its core platinum-selling artists, all while maintaining the same street ties and neighborhood presence he had before the money arrived, regularly returning to the projects even after buying a home outside them. Corey Miller's history with nightclub violence did not begin at the Platinum Club. In August 2001, the rapper known as Sea Murder, already a platinum-selling artist on his brother Master P's No Limit Records, went to Club Rags on Plank Road in Baton Rouge and was told he would need to be searched before entering with a firearm. Surveillance video later showed Miller pulling a semi-automatic pistol from his waistband and attempting to fire on the club's owner and a bouncer. The gun jammed. No one was hurt, but Miller was eventually charged with 2 counts of attempted second-degree murder, a case that was still pending when a second, far more serious incident occurred 5 months later. On the night of January 12, 2002, the Platinum Club in Harvey, Louisiana, was packed for a rap competition. 16-year-old Steve Thomas had just stepped off stage after performing when he was attacked by a group near the club's VIP section. Miller joined the assault before a bouncer, Darnell Jordan, pulled him away from the fight. Moments later, a single gunshot rang out, and Thomas was found on the floor, fatally shot in the chest. Witnesses identified Miller as the shooter, and Jefferson Parish investigators arrested him days later. What followed became one of the longest and most legally contested prosecutions in Louisiana history. His first conviction, secured in September 2003, was overturned in 2004 after a judge found that prosecutors had withheld criminal background information about key witnesses that could have been used to challenge their credibility. Misconduct the Louisiana Supreme Court later affirmed as grounds for a new trial. Miller's second trial ran in August 2009 in Louisiana's 24th Judicial District Court. The defense again attacked the credibility of the club patrons who identified him, but a 12-person jury convicted him of second-degree murder on a non-unanimous 10-2 vote, a margin that would later become legally significant after Louisiana abolished non-unanimous jury convictions for future cases, a change the courts have not applied retroactively to convictions that were already final, including Miller's. He was sentenced to mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole. Weeks later, in the still-pending Club Rags case from 2001, Miller pleaded no contest to the attempted murder charges and was sentenced to an additional 10 years, largely offset by time already served, a sentence prosecutors pursued mainly to guarantee his continued incarceration in case the murder conviction was ever overturned again. He was transferred to the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, where the great majority of reporting places him as of the most recent public record, though a small number of more recent accounts have suggested a possible transfer to another Louisiana facility, a detail that remains unconfirmed against the weight of established sourcing. Miller's imprisonment drew sustained international attention in a way none of the other cases in this file have. 2 of the trial's key witnesses later recanted their identifications, one claiming he had been pressured by Jefferson Parish investigators into naming Miller, and those recantations became the centerpiece of years of advocacy from public figures including Kim Kardashian, who has publicly and repeatedly called for Miller's case to be reopened, most recently citing a 2021 Louisiana law that allows post-conviction claims based on new factual evidence. Miller's attorneys challenged his 2009 conviction on separate grounds in both 2011 and 2013, arguing in part that the trial judge had allowed jurors to hear unsubstantiated testimony suggesting Miller had threatened witnesses. and that prosecutors had systematically excluded black jurors from his panel. The Louisiana Supreme Court rejected both appeals, and a state appellate court later upheld the conviction again after the witness recantation surfaced in 2018, finding the new statements insufficient to overturn the verdict. Despite the recantations and the outside pressure, Louisiana courts have consistently denied Miller's appeals, including a final rejection from the state Supreme Court that found he had exhausted his available options for review. From inside prison, Miller has continued to write and release music addressing his case directly, including tracks that state corrections officials investigated for possibly being recorded without authorization, an inquiry that was ultimately unable to conclusively prove how the recordings were made. Today, more than 2 decades after his arrest, Corey Miller remains incarcerated, his conviction upheld, his advocates undeterred, and his case still functioning as one of the clearest examples of how a life sentence can outlast the news cycle that created it.